Okay, good evening. Welcome to episode 28 of my Yamaha Virago Cafe Racer project. My name is Scott McCutcheon of Sovereign Studios. Thanks for tuning in. If you're just joining in with us, we've finally got the battery box installed, and now we can do one of the most fun parts of the bike, wiring. I know a lot of you guys have been asking about it, waiting for me to get here. And I'm finally there. So, now we can actually start looking at the wiring harness and see exactly what we need to do to get the bike powered up and running. We're basically going to rebuild the wiring harness from scratch. And I'm hoping that we won't have to do, well, we're going to end up having to do a lot of custom modification to it to make it work. But I think we're going to end up using a little bit of the old harness and a lot of new wiring to put this thing together. So we'll talk about that more as we go further into this video. But I'm sure the whole thing will come together in parts. I think I'm going to try and do it more like one video per system, kinda. So we'll kind of see how that goes as we progress. But this first one, I think we're gonna just look at the wiring harness, talk a little bit about how we might actually get it put together, what all we need to consider while we're putting it together, and we'll look at what parts I have ready for it, what kind of work we're going to be needing to do, and then we'll kind of go from there. All right, so let's get started. Okay, hopefully you guys have a good look at this. I can see this pretty well. So this is the wiring harness. This is the original OEM stock 1981 to 83 Yamaha Virago XV750 wiring harness. So this is what you would have got from the factory. Obviously you can see that I've already kind of exploded it. You guys may have seen this kind of sitting in the background of the rest of my videos previously. But you can see where I've kept some of the other pieces just more or less intact, like the controls and that sort of stuff. Here's the fuse block. These are the original gauges right here. And then here's this mess that would have been, I think, sitting behind the headlamp. And then this, this is the rest of the harness here that would have gone underneath the tank and against the frame. Right up here you'll see the pigtails for the ignition modules. Those will plug in there, or I guess to the actual I'm drawing a blank. These stupid things. Yeah, the ignition spark plug coils. So those will plug in there. This is the connector for the ignition control module itself. The other end of the ignition control module, you'll see we already plugged this in a previous video, and this one just comes down here and goes directly into the voltage regulator, which then heads off to the stator. So this has a connector in the wiring harness as well, somewhere right here, to connect the voltage regulator. And then the rest of this stuff back here is what would have been crammed under the original Virago seat. And this is all the relays and stuff like that. This piece right here goes off to the starter switch, or starter solenoid. This is your kickstand switch. These are your rear brake lights. Here's the oil level switch. These are for the turn signals and tail light, I think. Here's the turn signals. Yeah, there's the turn signals. Again, that was the voltage relay. These two right here are your primary ground and primary power, right there. And then you have all your relays back here. So I already kind of went through and labeled them. we have our starter cutout relay, the starter relay, the side stand relay. Here's your headlamp relay. This is the diode. I kind of don't really remember exactly what this does, but we'll look it up and figure that out when we get a little further down the line. This is your turn signal cancel switch. Again, I'm not really sure what this is. Was this like automatic turn signal canceling? Is that what this is? I don't know. We may not use this. I'm not sure what that is yet. But this is the turn signal relay itself. Is this relay here, and then I don't know what these two things are. No idea. But that's pretty much the back end of the relay, or back end of the wiring harness with all the relays. Up here is a more jumbled mess. This went to the headlamp itself. I forgot exactly what this was. This was the oh yeah, this was to the ignition switch, like the key. Here's the wires that go off to the right switch. There's your off, your run, your engine stop switch, your kill switch, and your starter switch. This stuff over here, these other connectors were for this, which was your left side, like the turn signals and the high beams and stuff like that. Then of course the fuse box was up front in the original Virago, and again the OEM gauge cluster, which is all this stuff here. So we'll end up going through and breaking up exactly what each one of these circuits is as we progress over the next few videos, and we remake these circuits, because a lot of this stuff, you know, isn't going to match anymore, so we're going to end up having to basically chop this kind of stuff up, replace some of the connectors, replace some or all of the wiring in certain places, you know, maybe try and salvage some of the more specific connectors like this one here, so that they can be reused. And yeah, we'll go from there. So what we're really going to do first, you know, I've already got most of it more or less exposed, but the trick with the wiring harness is, of course, this jumbled mess of wires. So this is a printout of the original XC750 wiring harness. So this is the exact wiring guide for the wiring harness that I have here. So what we're going to end up basically doing is I'm going to create a copy of this on my computer in Photoshop, and as we progress and, you know, I continue building the wiring harness, I'm going to be updating my version of this dock so that at the end, when we're all said and done, I have a good and correct wiring diagram for my specific bike. Because we're going to want that in the future if we end up having to troubleshoot stuff down the line. I'd rather not have some like crazy jumbled mess where everything's the same color, you know what I mean? So to that extent, I've ordered, you can see I've got some good lines here. This is about 10 feet of each color. I've ordered some other lines for, you know, or some other wires that are the same, like 16 gauge wire, but they'll have like stripes on them, so we'll be able to pick and choose between 20 some odd different colors to make sure we can get the wiring harness completed in a good manner. So in terms of updating the wiring harness and getting this all together, you'll notice that a lot of these connectors, you know, are kind of janky, so we're going to end up trying to see if we can replace some of these. Some of them we're not going to be able to, like the one for the voltage regulator and the other one for like the ignition control module and stuff like that. We may not be able to replace those. But the rest of them, a lot of the other ones, we're going to be able to replace and turn into custom connectors, like the ones you'll see here, like these custom connectors. You know, we'll be able to turn them into that. But one of the big things we're gonna do that I'm actually really excited about is because, you know, now that we're rebuilding this in 2020, you know, I mean, it's no longer a 40-year-old bike. And I really didn't want to use these 40-year-old style relays, even if they still work. They're huge, they're bulky, And I mean, relays are kind of bulky anyway, but these can't really be mounted easily anywhere. I don't have like a tray that these all socket to that I can bolt somewhere. Like, where am I going to put this thing? They're just going to flop around somewhere. Like, that sucks. As you may have seen in one of the other videos, we bought this modern fuse box that holds these Bosch style fuses, these modern Bosch style fuses. So we're going to end up basically replacing all of these older style relays with modern style Bosch relays. And like that one there, you know, that's the new turn signal relay, the one that has a fixed rate flash for LEDs, so we'll end up replacing it like that, you know. So it'll be nice to really get all of those relays updated to a modern standard. But as you can see with the fuses as well, these tube fuses are ancient, and you know, I'm really excited to get these upgraded to the blade style fuses. So we'll upgrade these to these standard blade size fuses. And one of the more difficult things that we're going to have to do is, because the original Virago mounted the fuse box up front and actually mounted it underneath the headlamp, like about here. We're basically going to have to find a way to reroute all of the fuses back here so that they basically end up in the in our custom box. And you'll see how like this kind of goes. Here are the slots for the relays, and here are the slots for the fuses, you know, and we'll basically end up just wiring it all up in here. I think based on the wiring diagram, I'm going to end up needing a total of 5 fuses, which is the 4 shown here, and then the main fuse, which I'm also going to wire into this box. You know, so everything all together, 5 fuses, and then I think it's 5 relays as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then the diode, we're going to have to figure something out as to where to put that. And then this turn signal cancel switch, I am not sure if we're even going to need this, mostly because on like the Yamaha R6, turn signal cancel, you just push in on that thing and you would cancel it. There is no automatic cancel feature. So if that's what that was for, then we're just going to end up ripping this whole circuit out of the harness. But I need to, I guess, figure out exactly what it was for and what its purpose was. But otherwise, that's pretty much what we're gonna do. So, well, you know, I started peeling off the tape around one of these joints. This is the joint for the tail lights and the brake switch. And man, when I peeled it off, and I mean the joint still looks good, but it left this crazy sticky residue all over this wire. And I mean, looking at that and looking at the wires themselves, I mean, even if these wires are still good, and they probably are, the reality is we're going to have to cut up so much of it that I think we're just going to go ahead and replace all of it and start with all new wiring everywhere. So that being said, I guess let's go ahead and see what we have to do to put the main fuse together. Okay, so the main fuse of the Virago is a 20 amp fuse, and basically the OEM Virago, it looked like this. It was basically a standalone inline fuse that was tucked up somewhere, you know, basically this kind of nonsense, and this would just plug into the harness somewhere, you know, and basically just hang out, right? Well, its purpose is to obviously protect the whole system from, you know, an amperage surge. So you can see in the original wiring harness from the battery, you know, obviously the ground goes off to the frame, right? But then from the positive cable, the positive cable of the battery goes down and connects to the starter switch, which we showed you in the last video when we put the battery box together. So right off this starter switch, and this is the original. You can see we're right off the starter switch. This was the primary battery cable. This would connect to the battery, and then this is where this main fuse wire comes off. So this comes off basically the same connection from the starter solenoid, would plug into this thing here. I don't know how. Maybe this is not the right one. Maybe this is a random spare that I found, but it would basically plug in here into this main fuse. And then off the main fuse, you can see where it basically comes down into the rectifier regulator, which you'll see mimicked here from where this main fuse is. You'll see this first joint, and this actually goes off to the plug where the voltage regulator was. So there's that first joint going down there. The rest of the wire, so once you hit this joint and you continue going up, the rest of this ends up over here at the main switch. So you'll see it come down here from the main fuse, over and over and over. Here's the joint off to the rectifier, and then the rest off to the main switch. So basically this whole thing snakes up through the wiring harness, comes up here, and eventually boils out to this. So this is that wire. This red wire gets plugged into the ignition with these three wires here, and in this case it's going to be this, the actual ignition module. So this one came from the R6, and you'll see that we've actually got 4 wires here. So we're going to have to find out how to mate these and figure out exactly what these were for on the R6. But shouldn't be too hard to figure out, so we'll figure that out here in a bit. But we'll worry about the ignition switch for probably the next video. For this video, I think we're going to see about doing the wiring that just goes from the starter switch off to the main fuse, which will be in this fuse box. And then I'll send the rest of the wiring out here, and we'll figure out this part later. So this is the fuse box. This is the front cover. This is the rear. Okay. And how this worked, obviously, is, okay, so you put this together, and basically the whole harness just comes out here, and you wire it all up in behind this. So, it came with, these things here that are basically the wiring connectors that you will plug in there. These are the relays as well. But for now, we're really just going to be worried about this first one. And we'll get to that in a minute. But for the time being, let's look at what length of wire we might need to go from the battery to the fuse box. Okay, so for the first wire, we cut out a piece of bright solid red. I think this is 14 AWG wire that we're using for this. And we seed it with this braided fiber here, just to give it a good look and protect it a little while we wrap it underneath here. So you'll see where we basically have it routed down into the subframe, same place as the primary grounding wire, and it'll fold up underneath there to basically exit right down there with the other primary wire, after which we'll connect it here. So I'm going to go ahead and
get a little eye hook on this thing so we can mount it up to the starter solenoid. And then we'll go from there. We'll basically be feeding the wire up through the subframe and over towards where the fuse box is mounted. So we'll do that here in a second. Okay, so as we get started, this process is more or less going to be the same for every wire we do. But we're pretty much just going to go through how we make this type of joint real fast. So in terms of connecting this thing to the starter solenoid, you know, we'll see that we have the starter solenoid here, there's the posts, and we pretty much just get an eye hook that'll connect to it like that. Real simple and easy, right? So nothing special. But in order to get this eye hook onto the end of the wire, obviously we need the hook. We've got a little piece of heat shrink tubing here that we're going to use to seal that up on the end. And then of course the wire itself and our braided cloth or braided nylon sheath to help protect that wire, since it's going pretty close to the ground and it'll be pretty exposed within that lower subframe. So yeah, so get out your soldering iron, get that nice and hot. You'll want a heat gun, and your heat gun needs to, or should ideally have one of these diffusion plates on it to help get a better heat spread for the heat shrink tubing. And then of course you'll need a little bit of solder to get that on there real well. So I guess yeah, first step, you know, just clip a little off the end like that. Go ahead and, since your wire's already sheathed, go ahead and get the heat shrink tubing in place around the wire. You want to do that before, because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up, you know, covering a portion of that sheath as well as a portion of the eye joint here. So go ahead and slide the wiring in place. Go ahead and get that good and crammed in there like that, and then we'll crimp it down in place just to make sure it ain't going nowhere. Now, as an added measure for joints like this that are going to be exposed, I like to go ahead and pour solder down into them to make sure that they get welded pretty well onto the connector. Right, so something just like that, just to make sure it's in place and stuck onto the connector real well. Make sure it's not going anywhere. And then we'll go in, now that that's done, back this thing back up in place. Right, so we want to end up with something like that. Make sure that we have the heat shrink tubing covering both the yellow butt connector, but also the nylon tubing. And then we'll shrink it in place. Perfect. Right, not too shabby. Okay, so keep in mind that this is a hot wire at the moment, so we're going to go ahead and disconnect the ground just to make sure that we don't electrocute ourselves or short anything out. After which we just feed this one down on through. It'll come out the other end, and there we can hook it up onto the starter solenoid itself. Okay, so you guys may be curious. I did find this boot, this like rubber boot. I think it's off an old like 80s Kawasaki or something. But basically, the idea here is that it goes around the starter cable, and we'll be able to cover the front of those connections and protect them from road grime and water and that sort of thing. So I put it like that. The idea is that we mount the power cables up next to it, and then we'll cover them with the boot before sliding them into this into their rubber mount. You may notice that I also added some vulcanized rubber onto the outside of this battery box, just to make sure that, you know, if we do happen to inadvertently contact the battery box with the power cable, we don't short something out. You know, so hopefully that'll help some of that. Okay, let's reconnect this stuff. Then we basically slide all that in place. It'll be more or less like that. This connector here for the starter solenoid eventually will connect right above the battery box, like so, and it'll be hidden out of way. We'll have to do something with this boot. I like the idea, but we need something better to cover it. But otherwise, that's how that works. Now we should be able to fish the wire through here. In terms of getting this in place, what we're going to want to do is, because of where it actually comes out of the subframe, we're going to want to connect it or tie it using that connector on the frame. So to get back there well enough, we're going to have to pop this little bracket off. And this is that custom bracket that we made a few episodes back for mounting the voltage regulator. We'll just kind of slide that out of the way for now. You may recall, like factory models use this as their air intake. We're not gonna be doing that this time around for our bike, so we just covered it up, no problem. All right, so to get your harness back there, you'll see that you know, we're just coming out from that little hole right there. We actually don't even need to do that. Now that I'm looking at it, we don't need to feed it through the hole at all. We can instead just come right up, and we'll cram it in on the inside of there, and then squeeze that back down in place. And that'll hold those wires. Perfect. Now, this guy, I think we can just go ahead and mount this back up. Okay, so the fuse box, if you recall, kind of mounts like this. And for the main fuse, we're going to use this one in the far back, closest towards the inside of the bike, is where we're going to put it. So what I think we'll do is we'll make the top the incoming and the bottom the outgoing power of this fuse. To do that, the box came with these this collection of little clamps and wiring plugs and whatnot. And this is the one we'll use for the fuse. If I recall, we actually end up using 2 of them to make it super complicated. Okay, so how this works is basically these come with these fuse blade type connectors that are for the wire. So you'll feed the wire into there, crimp it down together, drip a little solder on there, and then you'll be able to connect your blade type fuses into these wedges like so. In terms of actually getting them into the fuse box, you simply just wiggle them off and break it like that. After which you'll be able to slide them in place. You'll notice the the small notches in there correspond to the outer side of the connector, and once in place, those notches will hold the connector there until you basically get a a small pin and pry that hook out of the way so you can slide the wire out again. So in terms of getting this done, for that, we'll cut this wire to length and then go ahead and wire it up into the fuse box. So in terms of just getting the right length, again, this was the fuse box and it more or less mounted right about here. With this, we'll basically really just be feeding the wire down like so and directly over to the fuse. So I'd say something like that. And I'd say now that we know the appropriate length of this wire, I'd say it's worth trying to cauterize it a little so it stops fraying. Go and grab a lighter. Let's grab our connector here and go ahead and cramp that down in place. Okay, and there you have it. There's our main power wire connected to the first piece of the fuse. And then of course, we just have our 20 amp fuse here. We just have our 20 amp fuse here, and it'll just sort of plug in and seat just like that. Pretty good. No? The rest of these, because of how tight and close quarters these are, the rest of these I think we're going to forego the heat shrink tubing. We'll just use solder and the connectors. And then the wires will come out and we'll try and get them seethed as well into one of the, I've got some larger ones. We'll try and get all of them into one big seeth as it comes out. So that'll be pretty good, I think. So there's our fuse, or the first look at how that's going to work. I think that's pretty good. So it'll pretty much just fold in like that, tucked in place. Okay, so I actually think we're going to call it there. I'm not going to go ahead and do the other side of the main fuse just yet. We're going to save that for the next video. I decided that mostly because while we used, a big thick like 10 gauge wire or 12 gauge wire to get up from the starter solenoid up to the fuse, I don't have anything but 16 gauge wire at the moment, and I think 16 gauge wire is going to work real well for most of the wires in the harness, but the factory Virago main power wire is definitely a 14 gauge, so I think I want to use at least that. So I think I'm going to go order some 14 gauge red wire so that we can make sure that we have a good solid thick main power wire for the harness. I don't want to go to the trouble of using the 16 gauge wire and then find out that I need to go and replace it anyway to handle everything on it. So I'm going to go get a thicker wire, and we'll do that in the next video. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this. I think now you can kind of see more or less how I'm going to be going about this. Hopefully this kind of helps you get started with your own wiring project. I think it's going to be awesome. I'm looking forward. I'm really looking forward to getting this working. So it's going to start falling together real quickly now, I think. But we'll get the main fuse powered up. And then the next step is going to be getting the ignition switch working. So we'll actually get the opportunity to turn the key get the opportunity to turn the key and make sure that, you know, this original R6 switch still works. You know, so it still feels like it works. So hopefully it's still in good shape. But we'll get that working and make sure that it can actually power stuff. So that'll be fun to finish up. So stay tuned for the next video. We're gonna be moving real quick. So catch up with you guys there.